Hello, my name is Abdullah. I am a incoming third year student of architecture at the University of Bath. It's great to meet you. Today I want to share just a couple of tips, if you will, insights for people who are interested in architecture, people who have applied to architecture, are going into architecture. And these tips, they're really things that architecture students pick up along the way anyway, but it's beneficial, I guess, to have an insight before. I've split this into 4 main sections. Firstly, we're going to talk about the culture, the traditions, if you will, of architecture school. We're going to move that into design studio in itself, which is kind of the main part of architecture school, with basically just a few extra bits bolted on. After that, we'll go into vision and resilience and the mindset to have as a student. And finally, we're going to talk about skills and reading. And things that you can do right now, perhaps, to kind of get ready for school. So make sure to stick around for that. 2 disclaimers, if you will. This video will probably be, negative, if you will, in a sense, at some points. And that's not to say that architecture is negative. Architecture is a great course with so many pros. But you don't need to know those pros before you start, right? Of course. So just take the whole video with a pinch of salt, of course, and make sure to be balanced. And not to be put off, of course. These are things to help you grow in the degree. Number 2, my view on these topics is of course skewed by the way my school does things and the kind of the biases that we have. So of course, maybe some of these things don't apply to you and won't apply to you. So yeah, let's start talking about school culture. So the first topic we need to discuss is the idea of a architecture school culture. And the culture of your school particularly, right? And it's something that you need to recognize it as soon as possible, so you can understand how you contribute to that or how you choose not to. And this will make sense, right? So every school has a way of doing things. Every school has a different set of values, a different set of experiences, different history. Because of that, different schools expect different things. So some schools will be very artsy, they'll be very story, narrative driven, etc. Some schools will be very context driven. Some schools love materiality. There's a trap that you can fall into, which is when you're in school, not recognizing that the values that you're that you're ingesting are those of your school and not of just architecture in general. It can be a bit tricky. So number 1, recognizing that every school has a sort of bias, if you will, which isn't a bad thing. That's how art works, right? Regardless of that, reminding yourself that school is a place for experimenting in terms of design, in terms of ethos, in terms of philosophy, right? You have to experiment, and don't be bogged down by your school and what your school expects, right? I mean, so for example, at Bath, what's expected very typically of a student is very perfect, neat buildings that are watertight and can fit. You can build them in the next day, right? Which is, maybe it's a bit strange to expect of a student, you could argue. So it's important in that context to recognize that, just because you do something a bit more experimental, it will be frowned upon. That's not a bad thing. Maybe that's a good thing, right? There's a interesting story that our head of first year studio, he told us that there was a student at Bath who took a brief once, and he read it, and he basically, after reading the brief, he decided that there was no need for a building as a solution to the brief. And he submitted a design report, right? And the entire report was just concluding that, nothing's needed here. And he got a first. People will, genuinely, people should respect you for pushing of boundaries and stuff in a way that isn't just obnoxious as well, though, because, this is where we get to our second point, which is recognizing the kind of chicken run race, the egocentric kind of race that is architecture school, in almost every case, basically every case. So getting pulled into that competition is not healthy, because then again, that competition is usually driven by your school's ethos. So you're just getting pulled to do what the school wants of you, and the best person who does what the school wants best, what the tutors want best, is kind of the winner, and those kind of people will get the best grades. But it's not getting pulled into that. You're not there to compete with others. You're there to kind of develop your own understanding of design. Nice doodles. Moving on from that, let's talk about Design Studio particularly, right? Studio is basically a place, and it's an idea as well. It's where you go to design, usually, if it's not a pandemic. And it's where the entire year kind of works together, right? So if you're working on a group project, your group works there. If you're working on individual projects, but you're working on the same brief, so you have to design the same building, then everyone works together and you can see what other people are doing for the solution to the same kind of problems, right? The best thing about Studio is the people there. You have a wealth of creative people next to you, on either side, in front, behind, right? You can really get insights from them that you never would have thought of yourself about your own design, right? You show them your work, they'll talk about it, happily talk about it. They'll give you advice, you give them advice, and it's an exchange of ideas that's so productive. It might even be the case that kind of some of the best parts of your work come from ideas from other people that you've taken inspiration from and that you've developed, right? That only happens if you're not precious about this ego and this idea that, you know, I'm a star architect and in the making and all this stuff, right? If that happens, it happens, great, but you don't set out with that vision. These are amazing people that you can really learn a lot from. Probably most students will tell you that they've learned more from their peers than they have from any tutor. Number 2, learn to manage your time. I'm sure you know the reputation of architecture students, that we work all the time, that we don't sleep, we don't eat, which is true actually, most of the time. So how I found out about this stereotype actually was in sixth form. I have a teacher who went to the same university as me. I think she was studying like chemistry or something. I told her I was thinking of going to Bath. I didn't say which subject. Her immediate reaction was, I remember Bath. She said, we used to come up to campus after nights out, like at 3 a.m. We used to walk up campus and we used to look left to the studios, the architecture studios, and we used to look through the windows and we used to see students pulling their hair out and crying and stuff. Look, you're gonna work a lot. You're going to have to make sacrifices, but those sacrifices are going to they're going to be a lot more if you take longer to learn how to manage your time. In first year, you're probably going to end up having some all-nighters, and it's probably going to be fun. It's fun until you keep doing it again and again and again, and then you just get tired and you lose passion for what you're doing. So really learning how to manage your time to minimize the chance that you fall into the stereotype of the architecture student. Your work is important, but your health is more important. Your mental health, your physical health, your general well-being is much more important. Think about the hierarchy of your needs, right? If you're worrying about basic things, you can't even get enough sleep, how are you gonna get it first? I am the only person here, which is surprising, but you know, it is what it is. Following on from that, learning when to say enough and being satisfied with what you've got, right? Your course will probably be set up in a way that forces you to face the reality of either doing so much work that your health collapses or being satisfied with it with a certain amount. For example, you could have a 4-week project, right? And every week you'll have a tutorial most of the time. And your tutor will expect certain things from you to make sure you're progressing in the right way. So maybe in the first week, your tutorial maybe say it's every Thursday, right? In the first week, they'll expect like a site analysis and context study, etc. But if you've done more than that, it's like you can't really, unless you get the first bit signed off, right? Because the next bit depends on the first bit. And maybe in the last week, your tutor expects drafted drawings, right? If you've got final drawings, but the tutor rejects the drafted drawings in the tutorial of the last week, you have to go back. So you can't really do more, which kind of forces you to push a lot into that last week. I mean, I've got peers who in first year they did 3 all-nighters in a row. When you've submitted, it's not the end of your project necessarily. I mean, the most important thing for a project is to put it in your portfolio. It's not necessarily to submit it to the university. And you can always work on it after you submit, right? Because your portfolio is on your own time. What a lot of students do, I think almost every student, what they do is they submit like a standard that's acceptable for university. And then they work on the stuff they couldn't work on after the submission, and they put that in their portfolio so they can apply to jobs with higher quality work. And they can do that on their own kind of timescale, which is very sensible, right? So don't worry, learn as soon as possible how to be mature with your time. Okay, so for this third section, I recognize this is basically a pep talk, right? Vision and resilience. You know where I'm going with this, right? It's so important to always have in the front of your mind at every single point that you're a student of architecture, exactly why you want to be an architect, and why you've chosen this path, right? This torturous path. People who put archi-torture in their bios, like what you do, they've got a point. You need to always know why you're here, because you will reach that point. You will have that crate, you will crumble, right? There will be that moment where you really consider quitting architecture. Everybody will have that moment, everybody does. We had a tutor, and in his office, he had a chair, and it was permanently called the cry chair, because he was so used to students breaking down. It's quite funny. I mean, it's funny to us, it's probably not funny to people. Anyway, this degree will teach resilience, or you want to complete the degree. I understand that this video perhaps is very negative. It's not negative, it's, you know, character building, right? Things I wish I knew. The whole point is that, you know, the things that you get punched in the face with and you don't realize, sharing those things with other people is what's important. Of course, this video is not gonna have 100 million positive things, because you don't necessarily need to know them. They're just great moments to realize. So of course, number two, the amount of skills and ways of thinking that we learn in architecture school are so vast that it would be a real waste for you to go through that entire process and become that person and then only use those skills in architecture. Imagine beyond architecture is what I'd suggest. That doesn't mean surpass architecture. What it means is, you know, we are on some days we're geographers, on some days we're sociologists, we're psychologists, we're physicists, you know, we're engineers, we're artists, we do so much, and we learn so many softwares and techniques of doing things and communicating and just producing, that it's a real shame for it to be limited to just architecture. You know, have hobbies, have outlets of production and creative, kind of your creative zeal that you definitely have, don't you? Because this is why you've chosen this torturous path. Don't think it's unfair to say that, you know, the skills you will learn will go beyond kind of way over the heads of many degrees in terms of the amount of stuff you just take in. And it's very common nowadays in the architecture industry for people who begin with a traditional architectural training to kind of make their own path within the industry, not necessarily, you know, leave the industry, which you can do anyway. I mean, you can go into, you know, set design, you can go into kind of graphic design, etc., game design, all that stuff. But more and more popular is this idea that you kind of you expand the industry and you broaden it and you enrich in it because you've just got this open mind. You know, do you want to go into biomimetics, which is essentially nature as a inspiration in your design? And you know, perhaps you have a background in biology, so you see how it's a two-way thing. The architecture, the stuff you learn within architecture, and the stuff you can bring to architecture, right? Look for that moment. You will find moments where you can bring in your own interests that have nothing to do with architecture, but it's the one degree where you can fit them in. You can fit them in somehow, right? I remember vividly in my first year, the University Art Gallery had an exhibition from a couple of students from UCL, who they created an exhibition of kind of this virtual reality / 3D holographic kind of presentation of certain architectural kind of landmarks in Bath, right? So it was kind of a mix of kind of game design, architecture, all this stuff. It was pretty cool. But at the end of the day, like, the skills you learn are far too valuable to just be used in building buildings. Develop hobbies, outputs, creative outputs that you can output your creative zeal into, beyond just your degree, because you may get frustrated as well if the degree's not working out, and it can really damage your creative enthusiasm if you don't have anywhere to put that zeal. Never be limited to any kind of confines. There was a beautiful drawing that someone I follow on Instagram did. It was called Elephant in the Envelope. It's a great image, I'll put it up here. Don't be this, right? Don't be the kind of the elephant who has such a wide vision, who's stuck within the four walls of a kind of perfectly sealed, neat little building, but nothing more than that. Now for this final section, let's discuss skills and reading. So this is probably the most popular type of question that's asked for any degree. What should I be doing before I begin the degree? What should I be doing during the degree, etc.? The university is not set up like a school, in that university will only take you some way towards being a good student, right? It will take you about 50% of the way, and the rest is kind of expected from you to kind of go as far as you're willing to. The answer to a question of, you know, what's expected of me is kind of like, well, that's your choice, right? You can choose how far you want to go. Straight off the bat, I think really important is to read more, especially in terms of architecture, because there's such a wide wealth of things that architects are just expected to know about. So many discussions and debates that happen within the architectural field that you need to have a grasp on eventually. Of course, you don't need to have a grasp as soon as you enter school, but this is more kind of during and moving through architecture school. Moving from being just a student, you know, your school will put out 50 to 100 of those every single year, to being an aspiring architect. The difference is reading, really, and being aware of kind of, you know, being aware of like isms, like any sort of art, philosophy and sociology. All these things are always connected together, right? And you have movements that affect one another. You know, art movements always affect architecture and vice versa. But don't fall into the trap of your reading making you someone who uses flowery language just to make it look like you read a lot. Flowery language and clear communication, these are two things which are opposites, because the objective of clear communication is to make it as easy as possible for the person listening to you to understand what you're saying. The objective of flowery language is to make it impossible for the person to understand what you're saying, because you're insecure about either what you're describing or your communication skills. So your strategy is to be so complex and hoping that because they don't understand what you're saying, the person who's listening, they'll just assume that it's gone over their head, when in reality there's nothing there. I mean, we can look at an example here. So look, I mean, I'm sure this is a, you know, very highly respected guy, and I'm sure he's great, but look, let's open a random page, right? Such a hermeneutical model presupposes a continual intersubjective self-realization on the part of you know, cool. Now, in terms of skills, what's one thing I should learn before I start architecture school? Learn to sketch. A sketch is different from a drawing in that you are describing and you're communicating, as opposed to creating an image. You're not creating an image, you're creating a diagram most of the time. It's really not about it's not presenting an image, it's really about presenting an idea. So you're communicating a concept. So here, for example, I'm doing a sketch of how an elevation would work, right? How a building in kind of a 2D orthographical view, how it would look standing up, right? Which is different. That's a sketch. Now a drawing would be, you know, much more kind of solid line. I'm trying to make this an image, a picturesque kind of product. The sketch doesn't really care about that, and you might have seen this kind of wiggly line I did before. That's simply all that is drawing with your fingers as opposed to with your wrist. With your fingers, you can achieve a much more kind of expressive line and something that's much more kind of dynamic. This is the diagram. This is an image. If your school hates making models, if you never draw a technical drawing in your life, sketching is just the process that will get you to a CAD drawing, a plan. It's how you think on paper and how you record your thoughts. Unless you want to kind of write out what you're planning, you know, a picture does speak 1,000 words, especially if it's a good wiggly sketch. Continuing on from the idea of kind of how university works in terms of how much they teach you and how much you learn yourself. Softwares, right? You'll probably self-teach. You basically self-teach everything in architecture. The purpose of architecture school is not to teach you specifics. The specifics are the understanding generally of tutors and lecturers is, you know, you'll learn this along the way anyway, which you do. But what you don't learn along the way, which you have to be taught, is a different way of thinking, right? The whole point of architecture school is to open your mind to a way of seeing design and a way of processing ideas. And a way of kind of logically moving through something, and that's what they teach you, the kind of specifics you're expected to learn yourself. So softwares, I mean, what could you practice right now that would help you in school? SketchUp. SketchUp is very similar to the idea of a sketch on paper, in that it's a 3D sketch really. It's very quick, very easy. SketchUp, Photoshop, SketchUp. Be an expert at these two things. And then jump into AutoCAD, which is the 2D line drawing software. Before starting, that's all you need to know. You don't even need to know them, you'll probably learn them anyway, but if you really want to kind of get used to some softwares, those three will take you a long way. On reading and what you should read, first of all, you'll be given some topics and stuff and some inspiration from lectures, so kind of the history, theory, culture lectures that you probably have in your course, and they'll give you topics to begin with. And you'll kind of hear names of authors here and there, and you kind of look into them in your own time. In the previous section, we had the mention of kind of things that you're interested in outside of the direct understanding of the degree that you bring in, and perhaps that's somewhere that you begin your reading. Don't be too kind of precious with it. Do a lot. So it's a horizontal thing. You know, don't necessarily have to read that deeply. but read very widely and be well grounded in that. In terms of recommendations before you start, this will serve you well. We said that the school teaches you a different way of thinking. This book very much will do that, and it'll set you on the right path for that. Apart from that, yeah, I do hope this was useful. If I haven't been clear on anything, if you want me to expand on something, feel free to drop it down below. I'll get back to you. Yeah, best of luck in whatever you decide to pursue. Never sell yourself short. Be confident, but don't be egotistical, because that is inevitably selling yourself short. And yeah, enjoy the process, man. Experiment. Don't take yourself too seriously. Enjoy. Be a high value person, and yeah, you'll be fine. And of course, this video was mainly about negatives, but you know, if we spoke about positives, we'd probably be here for about 4 times as long. So there's a lot to look forward to as well.